The Fall of Arnor is a dramatic event and well known by fans of The Lord of the Rings, but contrary to common belief, the kingdom didn't simply fall in a single event overnight. Instead, there were many events over the span of more than 1,000 years that led to the decline of the Dúnedain in the north and the ultimate destruction of the kingdom of Arnor. In our last episode, we looked at the civil war of Arnor that split the kingdom into 3 warring kingdoms that each fought each other. This greatly weakened the Dúnedain and is a conflict often overlooked. Nonetheless, it laid the foundation for its destruction, which the Witch King would soon exploit. In this video, we'll dive into how the Witch King came to Eriador and founded the realm of Angmar, how the kingdom of Rhudaur fell to his shadow, how hobbits began to settle the lands of Eriador, and more importantly, how the watchtower of Amon Sûl was destroyed and how the last prince of Cardolan was slain. So lean back, leave a like, subscribe, and join me as we journey back in time and explore the lore of Middle-earth. As we covered last time, the civil war of Arnor began in 861 after the death of Eriador. All 3 of his sons wanted control of Arnor. This conflict would continue as we move forward, but it's important to remember when we try to understand why the Dúnedain failed to oppose the power of the Witch King. The Witch King would first found his realm Angmar in 1300, but we should have a look at what happened leading to this point to better understand everything fully. Since 861, many events occurred. Around the year 1000, the Istari arrived in Middle-earth as they went ashore in Grey Havens, where they were greeted by Círdan. As I've explored in my video about the Blue Wizards, there are 2 versions of their story. In one version, the Blue Wizards arrive in the Second Age with Glorfindel, and in another, they arrive with the other wizards at this point. In either case, we know that all 5 of the wizards were present in Middle-earth after the year 1000. Their mission was to advise and persuade men and elves to resist Sauron. The wizards were Maya and were clothed in bodies of old men, restricting their powers so that they would only assist the peoples of Middle-earth and not seek domination like Sauron had, who was also a Maya. 50 years after this event, in 1050, something starts happening that sets things in motion. Gondor is at its height of its power under King Círdan here, that takes the name Hyr-Mendakil, the South Victor, after he conquers much of Near-Harad. Further north, shadows begin to fall over Greenwood, and the men living around the forest begins to call it Mirkwood. At first it was unknown what this shadow was, but it would later be known that Sauron had occupied the old stronghold of Amon that had once been the capital of the Woodland realm under Orofir's rule. The hill and fortress were then together called Dol Guldur. Under the command of Sauron, some Easterlings ventured west into Rhovanion and fought the Northmen in the area. Some of these Easterlings would continue into the Vales of Anduin and cause trouble for its inhabitants. This resulted in events where the hobbits are recorded in history for the first time. The Arnorians recorded the coming of the Harfoots and called their race Perinath, which roughly translates to halflings. So if it hadn't been for the historians of Arnor, we would know less about the hobbits and their history. At this time, the hobbits were split into 3 breeds, the Harfoots, Fallohides, and Stoors. In their earliest known history, the Harfoots lived in the lower foothills of the Misty Mountains, in the Vales of Anduin, in an area roughly bounded by the Glen River in the south and the small forested region where later was the Eagle's Eyrie. The Harfoots were shorter and smaller than the other breeds, browner of skin, had no beards, and did not wear any footwear. They had neat and nimble hands. They liked highlands and hillsides, and lived in holes they called smeals, a habit which long preserved and which would continue to be practiced much later when they settled the land of the Shire. The Harfoots were also on very friendly terms with the dwarves, who travelled through the high pass on the east road. It is possible that there would have been some sort of minor trade between their peoples, and this friendship with the dwarves might have been important. Because in this year of 1050, when the shadow fell over the Vales of Anduin and Mirkwood, the Harfoots began to migrate west. They used the high pass they knew the dwarves used. At this point the pass was still safe, and the mountains weren't infested by orcs and other foul creatures. The Harfoots continued west along the east road and settled near Amon Sûl, where they built villages and came in contact with the Dúnedain of Arthedain. At this time, Mala was king of Arthedain, the grandson of Amlaeth we covered in the last episode. In 1100, there was a secret council between the Istari and the chief members of the Eldar. They discovered that an evil power had made a stronghold at Dol Guldur. They thought it was one of the Nazgûl at first. From this point, they tried to counter this growing power, which will be important as to why Arnor might have been weaker as well. In 1150, the Fallohide hobbits migrated west as well. The Fallohides were taller and slimmer of build, and both their skin and their hair tended to be fair, and no Fallohide ever grew a beard. They crossed the high pass and joined their brethren in the Eriador. They became great leaders and settled with the Harfoots that had been living in Eriador for 100 years by this point. Around the same time, the Stoor hobbits migrated west as well, but they took an alternative route. Instead of using the high pass, they used the Redhorn Pass, we know as the Pass of Caradhras from the Lord of the Rings. Here the Stoor hobbits split into two branches. Some of them settled in the lower half of Rhudaur, between Mithlond and Bruinen, in an area known as the Angle. And the other branch settled in northern Dunland, possibly near Swanfleet. The Stoors in Dunland would learn new words from the Dunlendings, which would shape their differences later on when they started to mix with the other hobbit breeds. But that's a story for another time. In 1258, the king of Gondor, Romendakil II, defeated the Easterlings along with the Northmen allies. The strength of Gondor and their increasing friendship with the Northmen of Rhovanion might have postponed Sauron's plans, as a different approach seems to have taken place after this setback. In 1300 of the Third Age, the Nazgûl reappear. Their leader, the Witch King, founds the kingdom of Angmar, north of Arnor. At the same time, the amount of orcs increase in the Misty Mountains, and they begin to attack the dwarves that live there. The increased amount of orcs also made many hobbits flee further west, away from the mountains, and it's recorded some began to settle in Bree. In Angmar gathered orcs, evil men, and other evil beings under the command of the Witch King. At the time, it was unknown that he was the leader of the Nine. The capital of Angmar was Khandum. Here it was said that an evil race of men lived, possibly related to the Easterlings of the First Age. At this time, King Melvigil ruled over Arthedain. He was the great-grandson of Mala that had ruled when the hobbits first began to settle in Eriador. Malvigil's father was called Celebrindo. During his rule, the tensions between Rhudaur, Cardolan, and Arthedain had been good, and it seemed like the memory of the conflicts of the Civil War was behind them. At the time, there were no evil that threatened the three kingdoms, but it was not long after the death of Celebrindo that Angmar started to pose a threat to the peoples of Arnor. Malvigil was already becoming an aging king, and now things began to move that he might not have been prepared to counter. Soon after Angmar was founded, it waged war against the divided Dúnedain kingdoms. Rhudaur was the first kingdom to fall. Already in Rhudaur, the Dúnedain were growing few, and an evil hillman seized the kingship. This chieftain secretly allied with the Witch King of Angmar, and they killed many of the remaining Dúnedain in Rhudaur, and thus the line of Isildur was broken in that kingdom. In 1349, King Malvigil died of old age, and his son Argaleb I became king of Arthedain. At this time, the line of Isildur had died out in Cardolan as well, and thus he proclaimed kingship over all of Arnor. And for that reason, the kings hereafter started their names with Ar, meaning king in Sindarin. In Cardolan, the ruler accepted Argaleb's kingship, and his title became Prince of Cardolan. He did not descend directly from Elendil, but was instead of the blood of the men of Arnor. Yet he swore fealty to Argaleb and served him loyally. In Rhudaur, however, the hillman chief resisted this claim and made league with Angmar, and this sparked the beginning of an open war. In response, King Argaleb started to fortify the Weather Hills that marked the eastern border towards Rhudaur. 7 years after, in 1356, the forces of Angmar and Rhudaur began to march south across the open fields towards the Weather Hills. This group was likely led by the chieftain of Rhudaur, while another section of the army was led by the Witch King. The forces of Rhudaur laid siege to the Weather Hills, where King Argaleb defended the line. Here the king of Arnor was slain, and his son Arvelec I became king at the age of 47. Meanwhile, the forces of the Witch King laid siege to Rivendell, where Lord Elrond held out. The Witch King failed to take Rivendell and were forced to retreat to Angmar with his remaining forces. In this year, the Stoor hobbits in the Angle also fled, some of them back across the Misty Mountains. It is very likely that some of the hillmen or orcs had attacked the hobbits and forced them to flee from their homes. The Stoors crossed the Redhorn Gate once more and resettled the lands of their ancestors at the Gladden Fields. These hobbits would live here in relative peace, and among them would one day be born Deagol that would find the One Ring, and his kinsman Smeagol that murdered him to have the ring for himself. Back in Arnor, the young King Arvelec I gathered the support of the Lindon Elves and the forces of Cardolan, and together they drove out the enemy from the Weather Hills. They didn't pursue them back to their homelands, likely because of the remaining forces of the Witch King, and their numbers being too few to take them down. After this, Arthedain and Cardolan kept a guarded border along the Weather Hills, the East Road, and Lower Mithlond. The war was far from over though, and it seemed like the Witch King had only tested the strength of his enemies. For 53 years, the borders were well guarded, and Arvelec had a son named Arafor in the meantime. But in 1409, the evil of Angmar began to stir once more, and this time far greater than ever before. The Witch King launched a massive assault and laid a great host through the lands of Rhudaur and crossed the river Mithlond into the lands of Arnor. His intentions were to circling around the Dúnedain defences. After the host had crossed the river, they marched north towards Amon Sûl, where King Arvelec I and the last prince of Cardolan were defending. The Witch King surrounded Amon Sûl, the Dúnedain were defeated, and King Arvelec and the last prince died in this battle. The Witch King set fire to the watchtower and had it destroyed. He likely desired to control the palantir of the tower that was the most powerful in the north, but it was saved right in time and brought to Fornest for safekeeping. It is possible that the body of the last prince was recovered during the battle and brought back as well. As it's known, he was buried in the Barrow Downs that same year. In his tomb was a pile of treasures, including a blue jeweled brooch belonging to a fair woman that Tom Bombadil seemingly knew long ago, before the events in The Lord of the Rings. The last remaining Dúnedain in Rhudaur were either killed or fled west, and hereafter only evil men and servants of Angmar lived here. After the burning of the watchtower, the attention of the Witch King turned south, and he plundered the lands of Cardolan. There were some who resisted, but many that did were slain. The remaining forces of Cardolan gathered in Tir Gorthat, where they held out, but there were also some that fled to the Old Forest, where they hid from the Witch King. When Cardolan had fallen, the Witch King started to march north towards the capital of Fornest, that remained the last important stronghold of the Dúnedain. The elves had not been sitting idly by during this invasion, but had instead gathered troops. In the east, Lord Elrond had sent word to King Amroth of Lorien, and persuaded the king to send help. A force of Galadhrim's soldiers crossed the high pass and met up with the forces of Lord Elrond at Rivendell. In the west, Círdan had also gathered his forces and come to the aid of the young King Arafor, that had been crowned king at the young age of 18 after his father had been slain at Weathertop. Fornest was beset by the armies of Angmar, but Círdan brought reinforcements out of Lindon, enabling the valiant young king to repel his foes from the North Downs and Fornest. Arnor had been weakened greatly, but the Witch King was unable to press home his advantage, because at this point the elves unleashed their remaining strength upon Angmar. From the east came Elrond, that led the eastern forces of elves, and together with his kinsfolk of Lindon they dealt such a blow to Angmar that it was subdued for centuries. Arnor, however, was unable to recover its former strength. Much of its territory was already deserted. Arafor would try to strengthen the kingdom during his rule. But you might be wondering, where was Gondor during this war with Angmar? Why didn't they help? At the time King Valakar ruled Gondor, an unrest and rebellion was beginning to rise during his later rule, when the Witch King attacked Arnor. Valakar had brought many Northmen to Gondor and also married the daughter of their king. This would later spark a civil war in Gondor when Valakar died, but that's a tale for another day. In the next episode, we'll dive into how the Witch King once more invaded Arnor, how the last king was slain, and how two of the Palantiri of the north were lost, and ultimately how Angmar was brought to its knees and the Witch King was forced to flee from Angmar. Until then, feel free to check out the first episode if you missed it.